Let me tell you where I think many people make the biggest mistake when they read a situation like this. They start at the Federal Reserve. I do not start there. I start at the gas pump. I start there because that is where macroeconomics stops being abstract. A family does not feel the phrase energy-led inflation reacceleration. A family feels the extra dollars disappearing from a tank of gas, from the weekly grocery run, from school pickups, from delivery surcharges, from the quiet rise in the cost of almost everything that has to be moved, packaged, refrigerated, or grown. By the time the Federal Reserve responds, the public has already been living inside the problem for weeks. That is why this document matters. On the surface, it looks like a story about interest rates and market volatility underneath. It is really a story about how a shock in one part of the system spreads outward until it reaches almost everyone. Oil jumps, gasoline moves fast, inflation expectations stop calming down. The Fed loses the flexibility that markets had assumed it would have. Risk assets wobble, housing stays pinned under high mortgage rates, and ordinary households discover that the economy is not cooling in a way that helps them. It is cooling in one direction and heating back up in another. That is the trap. I want to stay with this point because it is the heart of the whole logic chain. A lot of people were waiting for lower rates as if lower rates were going to solve everything. They were waiting for mortgage relief. They were waiting for cheaper credit. They were waiting for a cleaner runway for stocks. They were waiting for the central bank to tell them that the hardest phase was over. But the moment energy prices surge hard enough, the Federal Reserve has to put all of that on hold, not because it wants to punish people, but because it knows that if inflation turns around again, the damage gets worse later. So when the Fed says it is not lowering rates for the foreseeable future, what I hear is not confidence. I hear caution born from constraint. The institution is looking at an economy that already has soft spots. Savings are thinner than they used to be. Housing affordability remains brutal. Certain pockets of the labor market are cooling. Credit stress is building in areas that do not make nightly headlines. Yet even with those weak points in plain view, policymakers still do not feel comfortable easing. That tells you the inflation risk is serious enough to dominate the conversation. And why would it dominate the conversation? Because oil is not just another input. It is one of the prices that can leak into almost every other price. When transportation costs rise, businesses either absorb it through lower margins or pass it on. When food production and logistics cost more, the effect compounds. When consumers spend more on essentials, they cut back somewhere else. That means you can have a weakening economy and still feel rising costs at the same time. That is why stagflation scares people. It traps both policymakers and households. The household version of this is extremely simple. You are told the economy is slowing, yet your life does not feel cheaper. You hear that the job market is softening, yet your mortgage quote is still ugly. You are told inflation had improved, yet gasoline just jumped again. You are told the market usually recovers from geopolitical events. Yet your budget does not recover just because historical averages say the stock market may look better 6 months from now. This is exactly where elite market language and everyday experience begin to split apart. Investors can debate whether a 5% drawdown is normal. Technically it is. Analysts can point to history and say many geopolitical sell-offs reverse often. They do long-term. Investors can argue that pullbacks create opportunity. Sometimes they absolutely do. But the person trying to buy groceries, keep up with rent, or decide whether now is a reasonable time to buy a home experiences a very different version of the same economy. That person is not asking whether the correction is statistically common. That person is asking why relief keeps getting postponed. This is where housing becomes such an important part of the story. The picture here is not one of a dramatic crash. It is one of exhaustion. Inventory has risen. Demand is not what it was. Price growth has flattened. Some sellers are cutting. Homes sit longer. Buyers have more negotiating power in certain markets. But mortgage rates remain high enough that even a softer price does not automatically translate into affordability. So you end up with a market that is more balanced on paper but still punishing in practice. For a lot of households, that balance is almost meaningless. If the monthly payment still does not work, the market is not truly accessible. And if the Fed cannot cut because oil keeps inflation alive, then housing stays locked in this uncomfortable middle ground. Not healthy enough to call vibrant, not broken enough to reset cleanly, just stuck. And the longer that stuck condition lasts, the more economic frustration accumulates. Now let us move from household frustration to institutional strain, because that is the second half of the picture. The pressure campaign around Jerome Powell tells you how politically loaded the interest rate issue has become. The White House wants relief. Markets want relief. Borrowers want relief. Real estate wants relief. But a central bank does not get to cut simply because everybody wants it to. If the inflation path is not sufficiently secure, cutting becomes a gamble. So what happens? Pressure begins to build against the person refusing to move fast enough. This is why the legal episode described in the source matters so much. A judge saying that the pressure campaign looked thin, unsubstantiated, and primarily designed to harass Powell is not just a courtroom detail. It is a signal that monetary policy is now sitting inside a broader political struggle. The president wants one thing. The central bank says the conditions do not justify it. The institutional fight spills into public view. I want to stress what that means. It means rate cuts are no longer just an economic forecast question. They are also a power question. Who gets to decide when the economy needs support? Who absorbs the blame if inflation reignites? Who controls the narrative if growth deteriorates while rates stay high? Once you frame it that way, the issue of the next Fed chair, the confirmation battle, and the possibility of a delayed transition all become more than personnel drama. They become part of the macro story itself. And that macro story is unstable. On one side, you have growth risks, consumer strain, housing fatigue, and broader demand weakness that would normally argue for lower rates. On the other side, you have higher oil, resurgent inflation fears, and the possibility that a premature cut would simply make the next inflation wave harder to contain. That is why I say the economy is no longer moving through a clean slowdown. It is moving through a conflict between two truths. The first truth is that high rates hurt. The second truth is that cutting into a renewed energy shock can hurt even more. Now, how should investors think about this? With discipline, not theater. The theatrical response is to say everything is crashing and nothing is safe. I do not believe that. The equally theatrical response is to say this is all temporary noise, buy every dip, and forget the details. I do not believe that either. The market may recover. Yes, history may favor patience. Yes, but patience should not be confused with blindness. The reason these moments matter is that they reveal what the system is actually sensitive to. And right now, the system is showing you very clearly that energy still matters, inflation still matters, and monetary policy is still constrained by both. That is why the source's discussion of stocks, Bitcoin, housing, and Fed projections all belong in the same conversation. They are not random topics. They are all different expressions of one central reality. People built expectations around easing financial conditions. Now they have to confront the possibility that easing arrives later and perhaps under worse circumstances than they expected. If the Fed holds longer, some leveraged pockets of finance feel more pain. If the Fed waits because oil stays elevated, households keep paying more for essentials. If markets realize cuts are not coming soon, valuations have to adjust. If the next Fed leadership change becomes politicized, the credibility of future easing becomes more contested. If housing stays frozen, mobility, affordability, and household confidence all remain impaired. You can see how the burden keeps spreading. This is why I think the most honest reading of this document is not rates stayed unchanged. The honest reading is that the hoped-for relief cycle has been interrupted by a fresh inflation threat, and the cost of that interruption will not fall evenly. People with stronger balance sheets can wait. Large institutions can hedge. Markets can narrate recovery. But ordinary households feel the interruption immediately because they live in the price layer of the economy, not the projection layer. That is also why I resist the temptation to make this either a doom story or a comfort story. It is a pressure story. It is about pressure on the Fed from inflation, pressure on the public from living costs, pressure on housing from high financing costs, pressure on risk assets from delayed easing, pressure on institutions from politics, and pressure on the broader economy from the fact that none of these stresses are isolated. So if I had to explain the practical meaning of all this in the plainest possible language, I would say it this way. The Federal Reserve cannot give people the relief they want because oil may be taking that option away. That keeps rates higher for longer. Higher for longer keeps mortgages expensive, refinancing difficult, and credit tight. Tight credit and expensive living costs squeeze households from both sides. Markets then have to reprice because the easy money bridge they were counting on is no longer guaranteed. And the longer this lasts, the more the political system will try to interfere with the institution meant to manage it. That is the chain. And once you see that chain clearly, the headlines stop looking random: gas prices, inflation prints, Fed pauses, Powell pressure, housing flatness, market pullbacks, and recession talk all become pieces of one connected structure. The structure is telling us that this economy has not yet resolved the contradiction between slower growth and sticky inflation. Until that contradiction is resolved, no one should mistake temporary calm for a genuine return to normal.